Let's see. So we're wrapping up alter ego this morning. Now, if you've been with us the last couple weeks, you know that we're spelling alter wrong. The psychiatrist or the psychologist would say it's A-L-T-E-R, but we're spelling it A-L-T-A-R. And what the altar is it's something that, throughout church history, that people have made sacrifices. They brought their gifts to the altar. They brought who they are to the altar. They've made those sacrifices. Now, the ego is really those set of principles that we believe about ourselves. Our ego is who we believe we are. Now, the first week what we did is we looked at those of us who just don't think enough of ourselves. We looked at what it meant to be inadequate. The world many times tells us that we're inadequate. People have told us that we're not good enough. We have failed and we've made mistakes. But God says you're not inadequate. It doesn't matter what other people have said about you. It doesn't matter what you believe about yourself. You are very adequate, and you're adequate because I say that you're adequate. Last week we looked at those of us who deal with maybe a little bit too much self-esteem. And, it was a challenging week for many of us. We looked at our need for control. We try to control our future. We try to control our finances. We try to control our friends, our schedules, our family. We try to control these things, and guess what? If we're trying to control these things, guess who doesn't have nearly as much influence or control in our life? Yeah, it's God. So we saw that as a spiritual issue. Now today, one more time, we're going to be asked to come to the altar and sacrifice some of those things that we believe about ourselves so that we can live out and embrace and fully discover who it is and what it is God believes about us. Now today we're going to talk about laying down our longing for approval. Now, is it okay with y'all if I talk about this? Are you sure? Are you going to be mad at me if I say something that offends you? What if this sermon's not as good as the one was last week? And I worked hard on that last week. I was trying to be, funny and insightful. And what if this one's not as good as the one last? Are you going to come back? Are you going to approve of me? So we all deal with this approval stuff, don't we? A lot of times we ask little questions like that, and we deal with this thing about approval. Now, let me just give you a little quiz, and this quiz is going to help you realize if human approval is something that you long for. All right, do any of you take criticism personally? Even if it's constructive criticism offered in love, is it something that you take personally? Do you have a hard time saying no? Anybody here have a hard time saying no? If you do, we gave you that volunteer sheet just a little bit ago. I want you to just fill that thing out, be as thorough as possible, and we're going to get you to work. And this is going to be good for you, it's going to be good for the church, and it's going to be good for God. Do any of you worry about what other people think about you? No, many of us do. Do you struggle with wanting the approval of others? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, maybe it's time to lay those things down. To lay those things down at the altar and start to discover and embrace and fulfill the very things that God believes about you. Now, many of you don't know me, and I want to introduce myself. My name is Craig. I am a recovering people pleaser. This is a topic that I don't speak from as a theologian or a pastor, more as a person who's studied God's Word and has thought about this a lot in my life. When I was growing up, I loved to have the approval of people. My mom is here this morning, and I still have a feeling after church I'm going to hint around. So how do you like church today, Mom? Oh, I liked it. It was cool. What specifically did you like about it? Oh, AJ, the music, that was good stuff. Was there anything else you liked about it? Like that little 25-minute thing where I was up talking to people. Did you get anything out of that? I would take tests and write papers, and I worked very hard as a student, to get very good grades. And it wasn't because I had a love for calculus. I mean, I could do without derivatives and logical progressions and all that harmonic balance or whatever they called it. It wasn't a love for that. It was I wanted to be approved by my teacher. Many times we seek approval from people, and even as a young pastor, my first church, the church wanted a young pastor. So the bishop sent them a young pastor, like the youngest pastor possible. And we had the little meeting with the staff parish relations committee and the district superintendent, and they're like, well, we wanted someone young, not quite that young. They made me go there anyway, and I worked hard. I'd like to say that part of the reason I worked hard was because I love God and because I love people, but I would get there early, and my office was a corner office, and it had two great big glass windows, and just two great big glass walls, basically. I'd be there late at night, and I'd be working hard, and I'd be trying to please people. And I'd see people drive by, and they could see me working in there, and they'd think, man, Craig is still working. It's 8:30 at night, and he's still working. He must love Jesus. Therefore I love Craig, and I approve of him and all his insecurities, and thinking about why he needs to come early and stay late. Now the question is, have you ever been there before? Just toiling and striving and giving so much of yourself to gain the approval of other people. I think that many of us, we have been there. Now I got some signs for us, and these are signs if you're longing, to determine if you're longing for the approval of others. Number one is you worry about what other people think about you. Number one is that you worry about what other people think about you. Now let me ask you this. Who gets nervous when it's time for some public speaking? If you're giving a speech, public speaking makes you nervous. Now, have you ever thought about the reason why public speaking makes you nervous? Because you're worried if other people are going to approve your message. You're worried if other people are going to approve your delivery. You're worried if other people are going to approve you. Therefore, we're nervous because we care, and we may care too much about what other people think. What about this one, social media? Okay, so you post something really profound on Facebook, by some Danish philosopher, and this is going to affect all your friends, and they're all going to like this, and they're going to comment on this, and they're going to thank you for this. And 3 minutes later, no one's liked it. There's no comments. No one approves you. Everyone hates you. That's why they don't do that. You posted this cute picture of this baby on Instagram. These precious blue eyes and these pale white cheeks. And not a single person liked it after you checked it 7 minutes later, and 14 minutes later, and 20 minutes later, and 30 minutes later. You're thinking, I'm not getting approved. But then it could be the other way. Hey, I got retweeted by 3 people. This is so cool. 117 people have seen my tweet now. Or what about this? Has anyone ever spent too much time on what you're going to wear? Think about that. Why are you spending time on what you're going to wear? Amber and I had this very discussion this morning. I got this shirt, and it's kind of in the top button is kind of in no man's land. I could button this one, and it just kind of chokes me, and it feels too tight. And this one, I just kind of thought it was too low and too cool. So I asked Amber, I said, which do you like better? This? Or this? I'm not even going to tell you how the conversation ended, but why would I ask a question like that? It's because I want people to approve the way that I look. Now, serious question. I want you to raise your hand if this is you. How many of you care just a little bit too much? How many of you worry just a little bit too much about other people's approval of you? Show your hand. Now, if the person next to you is not raising their hand, you can look over at them. And you can say, you care too much to even let other people know that you care too much, and you're not willing to raise your hand. And this is something that's universal for many of us. I don't think that you're excluded from this. So we worry about what other people think. We're often overly sensitive. I was playing golf with this young guy. He's probably 22, 23 at the time. He's 25 now. And I don't play golf very often. So if I pay $50 to play golf, I'm going to get a sermon illustration out of it. I haven't deducted it from my taxes yet, but I can now after I tell this story. So anyway, he was telling me about this girl that he met. And he's just a salt-of-the-earth guy. He's telling me about this girl that he met. They'd gone out on 2 dates. And he's like, gosh, I think she could be the one. We like the same things. She's funny. We know some of the same people. This is going to work out. So we turned off our phones. Neither of us had connection with the world for 4 or 5 hours. And After we got done, we went and had some burgers at the clubhouse, and I can't even make this stuff up. He had 18 text messages from this girl. And like, he started reading them to me, and they were really cool. I was like, hey, I just saw so-and-so, and it made me think of you. And like, next one was, hey, I had a great time the other night. When can we do it again? And like, hey, I miss you, hope things are going well today. And then all of a sudden, there got to be this little bit of a turn. Now remember, we're talking about you're overly sensitive. She's like, oh, I guess he must be busy. Hey, what's going on? Then at the end, it's like, I don't remember the exact progression, but it was like this. It's like, oh, so why don't you just tell me that you don't like me? Like, he says, what do I do about this? I said, well, I'll pray about it, but you and God got to figure that part out. But just think about this, though. Like, I really believe that sometimes we're just a little too sensitive. And sometimes our perception of what other people think about it is actually not their reality of how they think about us. Okay, the third one is you compromise your values. Approval of people, we'll compromise our values. Like, say, guys, I'll just talk to you for a second. Say if you're out with the guys and all of a sudden, like, all these off-color jokes start and, the language really deteriorates. You just want to be one of the guys. You want to be accepted. So all of a sudden, the values can get compromised real fast. Think about money for a second. Maybe we have a value that we're going to be debt-free, or we're just going to do everything that we can to be debt-free and definitely live within our means and pay off the debt that we have, because we know that that's not good stewardship. Now, let's say that there's this thing that we think we need. Maybe we just want it really bad. And if we have this thing, then people are going to approve of us. So what we do is we go out and buy it, even though we don't have the money for it. We go out and buy it because people aren't going to know if we're in debt or not, but they're going to know if we don't have this thing. So what happens is we compromise our values. We go out and buy this thing that we don't need to impress people that we don't know. It makes no sense. But because we're approval-seeking people, we'll do these things. Number 4 is we hesitate sharing our faith. Now, most of all, that we've talked about this being an interpersonal issue so far. This is a very spiritual issue, and here we see this. Being a people pleaser, being someone who longs for the approval of other people, it can actually be a roadblock for us to share our faith. You believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. You believe and you have experienced the forgiveness of sins. You understand and you embrace that you can be a new creation in Christ. You have seen God do redemption in the world through the local church. You have seen and experienced all these things. Yet you may have a friend that's just going through a really tough time. And you know that Jesus can make a difference in the life of this friend. So we have a choice. Do we share our faith, or do we remain quiet? And many of us remain quiet. And the reason we remain quiet is because we don't want to be perceived as one of those Jesus freaks, one of those religious freako type people. So we think it's better to play it safe and let this person suffer and struggle a little bit than it is to be disapproved for some religious beliefs that we have. People pleasing, it can make sharing our faith really tough. What are we more concerned about? Having a good image and reputation among a certain amount of people, or that other persons may experience the freedom and joy that comes only through a relationship with Jesus Christ. And number 5, you have a hard time saying no. Hard time saying no. You guys need to have that green sheet of paper filled out, turned in, during communion, during the offering. And someone comes up to you, it's like this, it's like, hey, can you help me with this? Or can you do this for me? And inwardly, here's the conversation that you're having with yourself. No way. I don't have time. I don't have energy. I don't even have the skills to do that. It doesn't matter if this is done. But then outwardly, we're like, yeah, sure. When can I get started? How do you want me to do this? When do you want it done by? How high can I jump? So what happens is, when we do this too much, and if you've done this too much, you know what I'm talking about, you're going to start experiencing resentment. Resentment toward the very people that you're trying to please, and resentment of your own inability to say no. All right, so how do we get to this place? How do we get to this place of longing, almost like an obsession of longing to please other people? Longing for the approval of others. Well, I think the way that most of us get there is that our egos are very insecure. Who I am is who you perceive that I am. If she thinks I'm a good person, then I'm a good person. If these guys like me, then I'm very likable. If these people have high esteem for me, then I'm a person of high esteem. In this case, our egos become very, very fragile. Now, here's the thing I want you to hear this morning. Here's the thing I want you to hear. Becoming obsessed with what people think about you is the quickest way. Becoming obsessed with what people, how they perceive you, is the absolute fastest way to forget what it is that God believes about you. Now, Proverbs chapter 29, we're going to look at some scripture to lay a foundation on how to move forward, if this describes who we are. Proverbs 29, verse 25 says, "The fear of human opinion disables." Okay, I'm going to stop right there. You guys know that this is true. Not only because it's in the Bible, you know from your human experience that this is true. The fear of human opinion disables. Trusting in God protects you from that. Now, do you remember the sermon series we did before Alter Ego? It was called God's at War. And the issue we looked at was what? It was idolatry. Now, when we place the approval of people above God himself, what we're doing is this thing called idolatry. Many of us can say that the approval of people is too big in my life and God is too small in my life. Many of us can say, people control my life. I don't control my life. God doesn't control my life. People control my life because my aim is to please them. And what we do when we, ask people, can I win your approval? What can I do to get your approval? What we're doing is we're putting them in a position where they cannot succeed and where you cannot be fulfilled. If you're asking people to be an idol for you, what we're asking is for a collection of imperfect people to fulfill all our emotional and relational and spiritual needs. And people cannot do that. It is not possible. Now, when we have this obsession with pleasing people, this is going to be one of the greatest limitations in our life here on earth. Now, I really want you to hear this. If this is a huge issue for you, this is going to limit your life until you deal with it. Now, I just want to talk about parenting for a little bit. If your aim is to please your kids, this is going to severely limit your role as a parent. Now, in the short term, we can do the easy thing. And that may be with the kids, the popular thing. But God did not put you here on this earth to do the easy thing with your kids. God put you here on this earth to do the right thing with your kids. Not to think about the short term, but to think about the long term. Not short term as a popular parent, but long term as a spiritual guide. Who are going to help these kids live into God's dreams for their life. It may be the very unpopular thing. Yeah, you can't do this right now, or you can't have this right now. And you may not like this, you may not fully understand this, but the reason I'm not letting this happen is because I love you. And I really feel that God is leading me to do this, and I don't think it's best for you right now. Now, if you're a leader of a business, if you have some responsibilities at your business, this is going to be a very important thing for you. You got really one or two choices you can make. Is the choice to do the easy thing, to keep the people happy in the short term, to be the people pleaser, or is it to move the organization forward? And sometimes do the tough thing that you're going to get some pushback from people with. This is really an issue about thinking, thinking long term versus short term. Short term, the easy thing is to please people. Long term, the right thing to do is to move people forward in life. All right, so how do we overcome the disease to please? This is really where the rubber meets the road. How do we overcome this? If this is an issue for you, how do you overcome this? Well, the first thing we do is we focus on pleasing God instead of pleasing people. We no longer try to please the crowd, but we try to please an audience of one. We put our chips in that basket. We go all in. We say, God, I'm going to try to please you. And listen to what Paul says. Now, Paul says this in the beginning. This is Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. This is at the very beginning of Paul's letter to the Galatian Christians. Now, listen to what he writes. He says, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people. Okay, so these guys are very early in reading this letter. It's one of the first 10 verses. And they read this, and it says, okay, obviously, I'm not interested in pleasing people. So you know what Paul is going to be writing isn't going to be the easiest for them to digest. But Paul knows he has to write what he writes because it's what God wants him to write. So Paul continues. Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. There's a guy in the church, this is probably about 3 or 4 years ago, he called me up late one afternoon. He wanted to know if he and I could meet together. So I got out my calendar and I was thinking, we'll probably meet next week or something like that. And he goes, no, I really need to meet tonight. So I said, well, why don't you come over? We met this little donut shop across from where I live. And I didn't really know the guy that well. He came wearing a suit. I knew his wife and his kids. And I'd see him around, many Sundays. But he was telling me about this problem that he was having with his business. He'd worked for this company for 13 years, and the management was asking him and his team to do something that he just could not do. He's like, Craig, I just don't think it's right. It's totally legal. We're not going to get in trouble for it, but it's not ethical. I haven't slept like in a week, and I just don't know what to do. Like, I know if I don't go along with this, I'm not going to move up in the company. I may not even have a job. He says there's repercussions, and I'm like, well, you realize there's some repercussions if you go along with this, don't you? And he goes, yeah, I kind of took this as a backhanded compliment. He says, I was actually listening to one of your sermons a few weeks ago, and you said, what does it profit to gain the whole world and yet forfeit your soul? And I said, well, I didn't actually say that. I just plagiarized it. Jesus is the original one who said that. So we talked and we prayed, and he had not made a decision at that time. He did not know what he was going to do. He had so much riding on this. I could look at his face, and I could see the anxiety. I could see the stress. I could see the fear. And he called me the next night, and he says, hey, I did it. I said, what did you do? He said, I told him I couldn't play. I was out. I'll still do what I can do for the company, and we agreed that I'm going to finish a few of the projects that I work on, and they're going to evaluate whether they want to keep me around. They're going to help me find a new job if that's the direction I want to go. And I asked him, I said, how do you feel? And I knew what he was going to say. I knew I'm stressed. I'm worried. Don't know if I can meet my obligations in the future. I knew that's what he was going to say. And I said, how do you feel? He said, I feel free. There's never a wrong time to do the right thing. He didn't please people here. I admired the heck out of him for doing this. He didn't please people here. He pleased God. It's an amazing thing when we don't live for the crowd, but we live for an audience of one. This is a big shift, and I'm going to tell you something you need to hear. And I need to hear this as well. No matter how hard you try in life, you are never going to please everybody. In fact, I'm going to tell you this. No matter how hard you try in life, you are never going to please anybody 100% of the time. It's just not possible. You cannot get an imperfect person to approve of you 100% of the time. I'm going to tell you this too. There's been times, and think about this, there's been times when you were not approved. Think about some of those times you were not approved. Someone said you weren't good enough. Someone said, in not so many words, I don't approve of you. Now, there's something that you have to know about this conversation. I wasn't there. I wasn't there when that conversation happened, but there's something that I know about that conversation. And that is this. Many times, much of the responsibility for your non-approval is in the hands of the other party. many of the times it was not nearly as much about you as it was them, because they bring their hurts, they bring their brokenness, they bring their history into this relationship. And part of the reason why you were not fully approved by them and the way that you wanted to be approved by them is because of them and not you. So the first thing that we do is we focus on pleasing God instead of pleasing other people. The second thing we do, this is good stuff. The second thing we do is we live from the approval of God instead of living for the approval of people. If you can figure this one out, your life is going to make a whole lot of sense in the future. To live from the approval of God and not for the approval of other people. So Paul, a sinner, a guy who made a lot of mistakes, he's writing to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verse 4. He says, on the contrary, we as him and Timothy, we speak as those approved by God, to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God, who tests our hearts. Paul and Timothy were approved by God. I'm approved by God. You are approved from God. There's nothing in the scriptures that says that you are not approved by God. Your failings, your mistakes, your fears, your inadequacies, you are approved by God, not because of what you've done, but because of who God is. Your worth is not based, I want you to hear this, your worth is not based upon what other people think about you. Your worth is based upon what God believes about you, and God believes that you're approved. Let me tell you a little story to maybe illustrate this a little bit. So we have a new puppy, Esther. Esther's just like this great big black puppy. She grows every day. It's the most amazing thing. She weighs about 85 pounds right now. She's 5.5 months old. She is as strong as an ox. You know, when she's done growing, she's going to be 150 pounds, and she is this beautiful black dog. And, you know, I'll walk inside, and Amber does this too, and Esther is approved by her mom and her dad. You know, we tell her that all the time. You know, you're pretty. You behave better than your brothers. You're a good dog. You know, we love you. You know, Esther, come and play with us. You know, she's approved. So the other day, David accidentally opened the front door, and we were kind of having this thing, and Esther got outside. This great big black puppy was free to fly. The neighborhood was her domain. And she, of course, ran across the street where this woman was walking these two little dogs. Now, any of you like little dogs? Okay, the rest of the story is not for you. So Esther's over there, she just wants to play. Now, I'm wearing boxer shorts and a t-shirt. I sprint out there as fast as I can. The kids at the school bus stop right next door to us are laughing at us as the crazy thing. The woman with the dogs was not too keen of Esther, and she wasn't very thrilled with me either, but that's a different sermon for a different day. So I take Esther back inside, and Esther was totally cool. Her feelings weren't hurt one bit that person had rejected her, because she knew that her parents loved her. She knew her daddy loved her. She knew her mommy loved her. Now think about this in your life. What would your life look like if you weren't so obsessed with what other people thought of you, how other people approved you or didn't approve you, but you were totally cool with who you were in Christ? Something like that. When we start living from the approval of God rather than living for the approval of other people, our lives are going to change. We're going to see that Christ was a servant, and we're going to start becoming servants as well. Yeah, we're going to see that Christ is forgiven us, and we're going to start being forgiving people. Yeah, we're going to know that we're loved by God, and all of a sudden we're going to become very loving people. You know, if you really want to gain the approval of other people, live from God's approval. I want to tell you a story about the last meal that Jesus had. Jesus was having a meal with his 12 buddies. Now, one of those buddies, his name was Simon. Jesus later changed his name to Peter, which in Greek, Petros, means rock. And Peter messed up. He just kept messing up over and over again. You know, there's a time that Peter, he went for the approval of people rather than the approval of God. Jesus was actually on his way to Calvary to die. And someone came up to Peter and they said, Peter, you know this guy. I saw you with him. Peter, he was just trying to be one of the crowd. He wasn't willing to share his faith. He said, I've never seen the guy before. don't know him. Two more times, Peter had this conversation with someone else. In both times, Peter said that he didn't know him. When Peter did that, I can't help but think that when he recognized what he did, that the tears must have just flown down his cheeks like rain down a rock. But it was really interesting. At Pentecost in the second chapter of Acts, God needed a guest speaker on Pentecost Sunday. You know who he chose? Somebody who he approved of, whose name was Peter. Because if God was looking for a speaker of grace, he had to have someone that had experienced it. And Jesus looked at Peter and he says, "You're approved." There's his older brother, Andrew. I mean, can you imagine? You never really heard much about Andrew. Andrew kind of plays second fiddle to Peter. But we can't imagine that Andrew just kept trying to earn his way. And Jesus says, "You're approved." Then there was James and John, the brothers of Zebedee. They were both there at that meal. There was one time they were actually kind of trying to figure out who was the greatest in all the kingdom. They had their mom go up to Jesus and say, "Hey, which is the greatest in the kingdom? Is it James or is it John?" Jesus just scratched his head. "What are you talking about? Greatest in the kingdom? If you want to become the greatest, you got to become like one of these little kids, humble like them." Then there's like a bunch of people we don't really know about. There's another Simon. There's another James. There's Thaddeus and Bartholomew. We just don't know much about them. But then there's Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. Matthew said, "If I get enough money and I live in a big enough house, these people are going to have to approve me. Because I got power and I got resources, and they're going to approve me." But he was broken, he was lonely, and he said he's going to follow Jesus. And Jesus looked at him that night and said, "You're approved. Despite your past, you're approved." Then there was Thomas. Do you guys remember Thomas? What do we call him? He was the doubter. He looked at Thomas and said, "Thomas, I know you don't quite get all this stuff yet, but there's one thing I want you to know. You're approved." Then there was one more guy at the dinner that night. His name was Judas. Now Jesus knew that Judas had betrayed him. Jesus knew that Judas was going to do his absolute best to get Herod's approval, to get Caesar's approval, to get Pilate's approval. And one of the 12 people that Jesus looked at that night was Judas. And he said, "Friends, this is my body that is given for you. When you eat of this, do so in remembrance of me." And as you take the bread this morning, I only want you to remember one thing, that you're approved. God approves of you. And later in the meal, Jesus took the wine, he blessed it, he gave thanks, and he said, "Friends, this is my blood. It's the blood of the new covenant that has been poured out for you in the forgiveness of your sins. When you drink of this, do so in remembrance of me." When we take this, I would just want you to remember one thing. Despite all our shortcomings, despite how hard we've tried to get the approval of other people, despite the times that we put God second and the approval of people first, you are forgiven. In the name of Christ, you are forgiven. And when we can accept this approval of God, when we can accept this forgiveness of God, God will do something in us and through us that we can be loving and forgiving of others. So let's pray. Lord,